Our scripture lesson is taken from the Gospel of Luke. Now all the tax collectors and sinners were coming near to listen to Jesus. And the Pharisees and the scribes were grumbling and saying, "This fellow welcomes sinners and eats with them." So Jesus told them this parable. There was a man who had 2 sons. The younger of them said to his father, "Father, give me the share of the property that will belong to me." So he divided his property between his sons. A few days later, the younger son gathered all he had and traveled to a distant country. And there he squandered his property in dissolute living. When he had spent everything, a severe famine took place throughout that country, and he began to be in need. So he went and hired himself out to one of the citizens of that country, who sent him to his fields to feed the pigs. He would gladly have filled himself with the pods that the pigs were eating, and no one gave him anything. But when he came to himself, he said, "How many of my father's hired hands have bread enough and to spare? But here I am dying of hunger. I will get up and go to my father, and I will say to him, 'Father, I have sinned against heaven and before you. I am no longer worthy to be called your son. Treat me like one of your hired hands.' So he set off and went to his father. But while he was still off, his father saw him and was filled with compassion. He ran and put his arms around him and kissed him. Then the son said to him, 'Father, I have sinned against heaven and before you. I am no longer worthy to be called your son.' But the father said to his slaves, 'Quickly, bring out a robe, the best one, and put it on him. Put a ring on his finger and sandals on his feet. And get the fatted calf and kill it, and let us eat and celebrate. For this son of mine was dead and is alive again. He was lost and is found.' And they began to celebrate. Now his elder son was in the field when he came and approached the house. He heard music and dancing. He called one of the slaves and asked what was going on. The slave replied, 'Your brother has come, and your father has killed the fatted calf because he has got him back safe and sound.' Then the older brother became angry and refused to go in. His father came out and began to plead with him, but he answered his father, 'Listen, for all these years I have been working like a slave for you, and I have never disobeyed your command. Yet you have never given me even a young goat so that I might celebrate with my friends. But when this son of yours came back, who has devoured your property with prostitutes, you killed the fatted calf for him.' Then the father said to him, 'Son, you are always with me, and all that is mine is yours. But we had to celebrate and rejoice, because this brother of yours was dead and has come to life. He was lost and has been found.'" The word of the Lord.
Thanks be to God.
I ask that you pray with me. I ask that you pray for me. Gracious God, may the words of my mouth and the meditation of each and every heart and mind here gathered be pleasing to you, for you are our strength and Redeemer. Amen. Before her death a few years ago, my mother would often tell this story. One evening, her doorbell rang. When she opened the door, there stood her older grandson, my nephew Tony, then in his late 20s. He told her that he needed help and that he had nowhere else to go. He had lost everything: his job, his marriage, his sense of who he was. He was desperate. My mother took him in, and Tony began the long road back to life. He started going to AA. He found a job as an electrician's apprentice, and eventually he enrolled in night classes at the University of Louisville. Like many families, we certainly have had our share of prodigals. But Tony is probably my family's best example of the prodigal come home. Look up the word prodigal in the dictionary. Exceedingly or recklessly wasteful. That's the first definition. But there's more. Extremely generous, lavish, profuse in giving. Some dictionaries, usually those large ones you find in school and public libraries, even reference this gospel story we just heard in defining the word prodigal. Today's gospel lesson is among the most familiar of biblical passages. Even the unchurched know the parable of the prodigal son. Jesus tells us that a man had 2 sons, and that the younger one demanded, not asked, his father to give him his inheritance. Now, we're not exactly certain what the custom for distributing inheritances was in ancient Palestine. Did the older son get all or more than the younger sons? Whatever the usual practice, the younger son's demand is both disrespectful and irregular. He behaves as if his father is already dead. By insisting on his share of the inheritance right then and there, he is in essence saying to his father, I want you out of my way so I can have your money and do what I please with it. The father, without a word of protest, divides his property between the 2 sons. Shortly afterward, the younger son packs up all his possessions and he leaves home. In a distant country, he squanders his inheritance. A famine occurs and he begins to be in need. He hires himself out and becomes a feeder of pigs, not an occupation for any self-respecting Jew, to be sure. He too is hungry, desperate, and would have gladly eaten the slop he feeds the pigs. After a while, he came to himself, or as some translations read, he came to his senses. He realizes that his father's servants are better off than he, and that while he cannot presume to be ever again considered as a son, he can ask to be counted among his father's hired workers. He decides to return to his father. Certainly, he was anxious about the initial encounter between his father and himself. He carefully practices the speech that he will give upon arriving home. Then he sets off. While he is still just a speck on the landscape, the father sees him. We can imagine the father squinting to make sure his eyes don't deceive him. Certain that it is indeed his wayward child, and filled with compassion, the father runs toward the younger son. He embraces him and kisses him. Immediately the son begins his rehearsed speech. Father, I have sinned against heaven and before you. I am not worthy to be called your son. But the father doesn't stop to listen. Already he is commanding his servants, quickly bring out a robe, the best one, and put it on him. Put a ring on his finger and sandals on his feet. The father bestows upon the younger son all those things that symbolize that indeed this is a beloved child. But there's more. Get that fatted calf and kill it. Let's eat and celebrate, for this son of mine was dead and is alive again. He was lost and is found. Glory be. The older son has been out all day working in the field, sweating in the heat of the day. He arrives home. The noise from the music and the dancing of the welcome home bash for his younger brother reaches his ears. He becomes suspicious. No one told him anything about a party. So he asks a servant what's going on. The servant, naively thinking that he is about to relate good news, informs the older son that his brother has come home and that they are celebrating because your father has got him back safe and sound. The older son is miffed. Tired and dirty and hungry as he must have been, he won't come into the house. There he stands, darkness falling all around him, unwilling to enter the lighted house, filled with laughter and music. So the father goes outside to beg the older son to join the festivities. Now the older son also demonstrates a lack of respect. He does not address his father by his title, but lashes out at him in a verbal attack. He says to his father, listen, kind of like, listen up, you. All these years I've been working like a slave for you. I've never disobeyed you. yet you never let me have even a little party with my friends. But this son who treated you like dirt comes back, and you throw him a humdinger of a party. Full of self-pity and jealousy and resentful over what he perceives as unfair treatment, the older son pulls away from his father. He refuses to acknowledge that the younger son is his brother. Self-righteously, he refers to his younger brother as this son of yours. The celebration going on inside is grossly offensive to this older son. Sure, fine, let the penitent return home. But bread and water, not a fatted calf, to sackcloth and ashes, not to fine clothes and jewels, to groveling and tears, not dancing and merrymaking. Why should he attend such a party? Is there no justice? Is there to be no distinction between those who keep the law and practice high standards of behavior and those who defy acceptable conduct? Or even worse, are those who rebel against parental authority, who act as if they wish the parent were out of the picture, who squander their good fortune to be favored over faithful, duty-bound children? Once again, the father reaches out to his son. When the elder son argues his case, the father does not disagree or belittle him. The first word the father says is son. A better translation for the Greek word used here is child. The father affirms their close relationship. Son or child, you are always with me, and all that is mine is yours. The father also reminds him that they are discussing not only the father's son, but also the older son's younger brother. I invite you to turn to the handout, which is a photo image of Rembrandt's painting, The Prodigal Son. The original hangs in the Hermitage in St. Petersburg, Russia. The elder son stands to the side, the main observer of the reunion between the father and the younger son. As the father embraces the penitent, the elder son stands outside the circle of love, refusing to enter. Although he directs his gaze toward the father, his face conveys no compassion. He does not share in the joy of this homecoming. We can read no expression of welcome from him. He does not reach out to either his father or brother. With hands clasped and held close to his body language says it all. He stands frozen in self-righteous indignation. Like the Pharisees and scribes who grumble that Jesus welcomes sinners and eats with them, the elder son is proud of the life he lives, a life based on the merit system. He has done all the things that a good and faithful child does. He worked hard, obeyed his father, and stayed at home to fulfill his duty as the elder son. In his own way, he is as lost as his greedy and lustful brother. In Rembrandt's painting, he stands stiff and self-sufficient. In the parable, he stands outside the house, frozen in resentment that his father has so graciously pardoned his brother, welcomed him home, and renewed his place within the household, while his own diligence in observing the laws of his religion, society, and family seem to have gone unnoticed and to have been unappreciated. In both the parable and the painting, he keeps his distance from his father and from his brother. We don't know what eventually happens to the older son. Does he allow himself to be persuaded to enter the house and join the celebration? Does he embrace his brother and welcome him home? Does he sit at table with his father and brother and share the feast in love and joy? Does he, like his younger brother, recognize that he too has sinned against heaven and before his father? Will he acknowledge that he too stands in need of God's forgiving grace? We can only hope that the older brother repented of his alienation from his father and brother, that he returned his father's gesture of affection, welcomed and embraced his brother, and began to experience the joy and freedom that come from being part of a gracious household. If not, he will have become recklessly wasteful, rejecting the love offered to him by his father and the opportunity to participate in the life of restored relationship within his family. He will become a prodigal son. Still, the real focus of this story is not the younger son. And it's not the older son. It's the Father. Jesus tells us there was a man who had 2 sons. Being wasteful, remember, is not the only definition of prodigal. A prodigal is also one who is profuse in giving. And this father is indeed profuse in his giving and forgiving. This father runs to meet his younger son, a son who had pushed him aside for the attractions of the world, for pleasure, for fast living. In ancient Palestine, it was considered undignified for a grown man to run. Yet the father pushes aside all concern for respectability and runs to embrace his child. One commentator says this: no image has come closer to describing the character of God than the waiting father, peering down the road longing for the son's return, then springing to his feet and running to meet him. This father doesn't wait to hear his younger son complete his confession, but instead orders the servants to clothe his son in finery and to prepare an elaborate celebration in his honor. This father refuses to allow the elder son to wallow in resentment and jealousy. Instead, he reminds his elder child that everything he has is his, that he, the Father, is always with the Son. This Father persists in giving. He's the persistent prodigal, excessive in his gracious actions towards his children. They insult him. They ignore him. One behaves as if the Father doesn't exist, and the other resents the conditions of existence within the Father's household. Yet the Father runs toward the one with open arms, embraces and kisses him, and honors him with a feast. And then the Father leaves that feast and comes to meet the other, invites him to join the celebration, and reminds him that he is a beloved child. This Father does not force himself upon his children, but eagerly yearns to reach out to them. He lavishes love on both his sons. Although rejected, rebelled against, resented, he still longs for his children's reconciliation. This Father's love knows no limitations, his mercy knows no restrictions, and his grace knows no boundaries. More than any other story in the gospel, this parable of prodigals expresses the boundlessness of God's compassionate love. Are we like the younger son? Have we wandered to some distant land where we are no longer our true selves, where we have squandered our inheritance and feel empty, defeated, lost? Are we fearful that we can no longer be called God's child? Are we willing to let God forgive us, heal us, and be reconciled to us? Are we like the elder son? Has our heart become so filled with resentment and bitterness that we stand with hands clasped, refusing to accept and hold close as God's children those who do not measure up to our standards? Do we acknowledge and affirm that God's love extends to all, that all people are our sisters and brothers in Christ? Are we willing to stop finding fault and start seeking forgiveness, healing, and reconciliation? We know, of course, that the Father represents the Divine One. Like the Father in the parable, Jesus Christ is persistently prodigal. Like a mother hen gathering her brood about her, he yearns to gather us in his forgiving and compassionate arms. He does not coerce us, but he does persist in his longing of us. He whispers it to our hearts, sings it to our souls, speaks it to our minds. And he reminds us lovingly, but emphatically, that his household is ruled by sheer grace and is open to all people everywhere. So come, even on a cold, rainy day in Lent, join the party. Be you penitent or proud, wasteful or workaholic, younger child or older child, come to Jesus, whose lavish love is greater than any and all our sin.